we've essentially sold out a lot of people's futures by being less than candid with them about the implications of what it means to never get married and have kids.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited to be joined today by Aaron Renn. Aaron, thanks for jumping on here today.
Thanks for having me.
Aaron, why don't you describe real quick your bio and what you're up to right now?
Sure. So I am a writer on Christianity and culture broadly, based in the Indianapolis area. This is essentially my third career, though. I grew up in rural southern Indiana, was from Catholic family on both sides, but my mother left the Catholic Church during the Charismatic Renewal movement in the 70s. I was raised in a Assemblies of God church, went to college, then in Chicago, I was a corporate consultant, worked for Accenture for many years, had like essentially a almost 20-year career in that space. Then I moved to New York. I became a writer and researcher on urban policy, and particularly the cities in the Midwest. And then I sort of essentially branched off and expanded more, especially as I saw this the intersection of the church and men is where I got started because I saw these young men turning to the online influencers, not to the church, and what's up with that. And then it just sort of took off from there. I would say today my religious journey has been towards sort of a Presbyterian outlook, although I attend a non-denom Baptistic church today. So I've been a
Awesome. And you had kind of a journey from living in Manhattan back to Indianapolis. Tell me just a little bit about that decision to go back to your homeland.
Yeah, well, very providential as we left New York City in December 2019, which was about 2 to 3 months before the pandemic blew the whole world out. So, when my fellowship ended there, it was time to decide what to do. And my wife and I are both from Indiana, originally rural Southern Indiana, and we had a young son. It was 2 years old, and so it made a lot of sense to come back to Indiana and, I'm probably, here to stay, at some level. You never know. I would say in my ideal world, if I somehow had $1 billion or something, I would split my time between New York and Indianapolis. So I love where we are now. I love our old apartment in New York, and if I could have both of those at the same time, that would be great.
Yeah.
But for certainly for a while, I think we're here.
Awesome. Well, there's so many threads, Aaron, I would love to pull on that you have touched over the years on your Substack and on the different articles you've written. But I think I would love to start with sort of a broad question and just I'm curious how you'd respond to this. So I want to know if you had to put your finger on the systemic problem that you see between the Christian community and how the Christian community is interacting with like kind of modern Western culture, American culture. Is there something that to you just feels like, guys, we're getting this wrong? Like we don't get this. This is so foundational. Is there a sort of first principles critique that you find just constantly coming up in your work that you describe?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the idea of the Christian community is very diverse. It's not one monolithic group of people. I have tended to focus on evangelicals. I don't know the Catholic world as well. I don't know the mainline world as well. I think within evangelicalism itself, there are, several different tribes. So with all that said, I am somewhat of a little bit of sort of an anthropologist slash journalist here in the sense that although I was raised in a rural Assemblies of God environment and all of that, culturally I am not of the mold of the typical, evangelical.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's the church I attend now is much closer to median evangelicalism, a non-denominational suburban megachurch. And I always feel like I'm visiting a foreign country every Sunday morning because I'm like, this isn't my,
Yeah.
the music, it's all its own thing. So I'm kind of like, I'm trying to like figure it out. So, and figuring it out, it's interesting it's very hard to try to understand something and be able to articulate what it is and its strengths and its weaknesses without either sort of glamour, oh, this is the one true way it's supposed to be, or sort of demonizing it's bad. Everybody's got a rap sheet.
Mm.
As I like to say, we're all people with our own strengths and weaknesses, our own quirks and our own gifts.
Mm.
And I think groups of people are like that too, and evangelicalism is one. But one thing I would say that jumps out at me, with all those like caveats in mind, is there's really kind of two things. One is that American evangelicalism is sort of, I would call, neglects creation
Mm,
in the sense, and again, maybe the most extreme form you would see was this sort of end times dispensationalism that was very common in the 80s, in which I'm very familiar with. It's, there's going to be a rapture any minute, probably. And once this age is over, the earth is going to be completely destroyed and we're going to be over. So, in other words, there's really no significance to anything that happens here apart from saving souls. We're just here to survive till the rapture
mm,
or survive till we die. And in the meantime, sort of converting people to Christianity and helping them at the individual level to transform their lives to become more sanctified is really that.
mm,
There's a line that's attributed, it's often attributed to Dwight Moody, although I believe it was actually said by someone else whose name escapes me, but someone similar to that era who made a statement to the effect of, "Anything we do other than saving souls is like polishing the brass on a sinking ship."
mm.
And I think because of that,
Yeah.
evangelicals have a weak sense of creation and building
Mm,
uh, for the future. So I think it's almost anti-material, in a sense.
yeah.
Yeah, there. The second thing, one other thing I throw in there that I think interacts is evangelicalism is very populist. It was definitely a movement of sort of middle class. It's kind of a middle class movement, a populist democratic movement, and therefore evangelicals have been very weak in mastering and gaining presence in the senior-most positions of the key domains of society and the institutions that shape
Mm,
our society. So, uh, I would say, look, the most famous one I could say is there are no evangelicals on the Supreme Court,
mm,
right? There are Republicans appointed 6 members of the Supreme Court. I think all 6 are Catholics. No evangelical major presidents of universities or foundations. Very little representation in high finance, elite media, Silicon Valley, and I'm not saying it's 0 in the Supreme Court.
yeah.
It's mostly not 0 in those other fields, but it's very small,
Mm,
and so evangelicalism is essentially trapped at a place where evangelicals are not able to basically shape society in any material way, and I think have overly focused on the way of doing it as politics, when in reality, politics is only one and often not the definitive, thing. So I think those are 2 things that have sort of kind of, trapped evangelicals a little bit of a box,
yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, that's a really interesting critique. Yeah, it's like before the internet, it was difficult for me to really see how much influence, these institutions and Catholics have, but now that I just as you kind of just see different commentators, writers, even in the popular world, like the Lila Roses, the Matt Walshes, the Michael Knowles, there's so many Catholics, when you're raised in this sort of a little evangelical box, we feel like we're the only ones who really are following God. All these other movements, their theology has compromised them in some way. And then when you actually start to get a sense more broadly for who's actually shaping culture, I know you've referenced the James Davison Hunter idea. Like when you actually want to see long-term change, you actually have to invest in institutions. You actually have to understand how they work. And there does seem to be something within evangelicalism that is allergic to understanding the deep way in which institutions tend to shape society. We're very suspect of those things. And now I think that, and I was watching one of Tim Keller's kind of final things he said was he was quoting, I think, Daryl Hart in the idea that the soft underbelly of evangelicalism is their weak ecclesiology. We don't really know what we're building. Like, are we building like large institutions? We sort of the movement moves into parachurch world, then it kind of forms these very fragile, non-denominational, platform-based worship service ministries. It's just like what are we? And I think we're at kind of almost at a low point now where people are jumping ship. I know so many people who are converting to Catholicism and Orthodoxy, because we feel like we had like 80 years to solve some of these problems at the root, and we never really got it solved. And so,
Yeah.
how do you think about the project of actually moving evangelicalism towards something that is going to actually be more influential within the broader society?
One thing I say is most evangelicals are conservative politically, culturally. That's not all of them, but that's most of them. And political conservatism, the sort of conservative movement, if you will, meaning the think tanks, the journalists, the academics, the thought leaders, not necessarily the elected officials, but the people who sort of come up with the ideas, that has been Catholic dominated since its inception.
Mm,
So there were very few Protestants involved who were key figures in the creation of conservatism, and many of the ones that were, like Russell Kirk, I think, ended up converting to Catholicism. So William F. Buckley was Catholic,
mm,
and I think just that and some of his, associates on that account, it became very normative for essentially the Christian wing of conservatism, as say people who weren't Jewish, who were sort of, born Jewish, that's what you are. But if you're Christian, you're Catholic, and you may even convert to Catholicism. And that's true even today. A lot of the Catholics are converts.
mm.
Ross Douthat,
Yep,
Rusty Reno,
yep.
Matthew Schmitz, so Rob Amari, who was the guy the game is escaping me right now, but he was the head of the American Enterprise Institute, who was a convert. So basically, large numbers of converts. It's sort of always been normative there. And I think because a lot of evangelicals look to the conservatives thought leaders to be their thought leaders,
Mm,
there seemed to be kind of this sense that like Catholics really are kind of in all these places. Well, the truth is there's not that many Catholics either. There are a lot of Catholics on the Supreme Court, but otherwise it's not a huge number of Catholics. I don't think we want to give them too much credit for what they haven't produced. Christian Smith, who's a very famous sociologist in Notre Dame, he and a co-author created the term moralistic therapeutic deism, if you've ever talked about that. And
mm,
he's a really well-known sociologist of religion who is a convert to Catholicism. He just retired at age 60. He age 65, he retired from Notre Dame, and he wrote a piece for First Things like why I left Notre Dame. And he went on a critique Notre Dame. And one of the things that he said was that simply aren't enough elite researchers who are Catholic. And so, you can't even they can't even fully staff one university of world-class people, out of Catholicism. The other thing is that in DC political circles, there's a lot of young men in DC who converting to Catholicism, or you see people moving to Eastern Orthodoxy. In the grand scheme of things, that's a niche. Many more people convert from Catholicism to evangelicalism than vice versa. And in fact, evangelicalism is sort of like radically transformed the religious landscape of many Latin American countries.
mm.
And so I think we see kind of a very narrow stratum of people doing that. And I also think, the reality of the Catholic Church is very different, I think, to what a lot of people think. If you look at Ryan Burge, great scholar of religion himself, he incredible charts. He's publishing every day on his Twitter and his Substack and his books. And he shows the survey data that shows in terms of their practical beliefs, the average Catholic is much closer to mainline Protestantism than they are to any traditional theologies on things like abortion. So, the Catholic Church is opposed to abortion, but, half or more of Catholics are believe abortion should be legal.
Yeah.
So they have it has there's this somewhat, I think, different relationship to their church and their theologies among Catholics than Protestants. So I think a lot of Protestants have sort of Catholic envy, but they're looking at a very, very narrow slice of both elite society and of the Catholic Church themselves. The median Catholic in America, is not Robert George at Princeton. It's, something else entirely.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Well, I'm curious how you think about the elite, kind of people who have the ability to shape the way that folks think. There was a time where there was a lot of Protestants that made that up, 100 years ago, and that has shifted a lot. Um, I'm curious how you think about that historically, and then I'm very much trying to understand the role of the multi-generational family in the creation of what actually does shape society. It seems like within Judaism and within traditional Catholic circles, there's a theology of family that allows for there to be more of a multi-generational investment that I think can shape institutions. But there is something within evangelicalism that hits that reset button every generation. And so that's part of what I've
Hmm.
been trying to understand about maybe is that somewhere at the root of why we're not seeing what happened historically, where there was almost an embrace of an aristocracy, like everyone was trying to build, at least within kind of the more that New England world, like how are we setting up the next generation for success? Where are they going to go to college? Like there was sort of a continuous investment generationally, and within evangelicalism, that does not seem to me to be um, a widespread idea. So I'm curious how you think about the implications of that historically, and then how that's impacted the way the evangelicals build families.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, obviously, America was historically a deeply Protestant country. So, you go back to the time of the first census, right? America was basically 98% Protestant, and so we never had a state church like in England, but we did have a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion, and I would say we were a strongly Anglo-Protestant country up through, say, the 1920s. And then with, large-scale European migration and other things, as well as, frankly, you talk about multi-generation, you had these old, what they called WASP elites, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and, much of their money had come from fortunes made in the Second Industrial Revolution, say, the Rockefeller money and things like that, and what you saw is that the children and the grandchildren of those elites, began to sort of like they began to question the values of their fathers, and things like that. And so they became, and some of them kind of turned against their own class, became embittered towards their own class. So there was a great focus on building multi-generational families. I mean, there was tremendous institution building in this period. All those elite boarding schools, many of them were created in this, all the prep schools, the transformation of the Ivy League, and all of the various clubs that were created for the upper class. There were very strong norms of codes of conduct, and it worked to some level, but it didn't really it ultimately didn't transmit the values. So I do think there was sort of a mix of demographic transformation because you can't, think of yourself as basically an English country once you've had so many people from other origins come here, and then sort of a loss of confidence, if you will, in some of the elites. Then in the post World War II era, we sort of alighted on kind of this gonna call it this generic Judeo Christianity as our sort of national identity. It's European, it's pan European, and the Ellis Island immigrants, like my Sicilian ancestors, are included in that and things of that nature. So there were some attempts at creating a multi-generational elite. It didn't always work well, and I think the other thing was, that a lot of the institutions that were sort of dominated by the WASPs, they had to essentially they felt like it was incumbent on them to open up and share control of that with other people. And so, in essence, what they ended up doing was self-liquidating. And so you take, the schools like these Ivy League schools like Yale, right, which was, created to train Protestant ministers, and even as recently as the mid-century era, would have considered itself a Protestant institution in essentially in its legacy and its outlook. Even if it was a liberal Protestant institution, it was still a Protestant institution. Whereas today, it certainly has nothing of that, whatsoever. There's still a few waspy, legacies and things that go there, and, I'm sure they can tell a good story, and there's, in theory, a divinity school there and things like that. But like, the reality is it's kind of gone beyond that. And so, now it's, we switched to this more meritocracy thing. And so you really can't have like a multi-generational elite under a system which has a strongly normative idea of meritocracy. Now, of course, we all know there's so-called Nepo babies and all of that stuff. And if you have enough money, you're going to do okay. But even so, I mean, you can't, it's going to be a lot tougher to take your, not so bright cousin who's, only capable of getting a gentleman C and like installing him in an elite circle. It just becomes harder and harder to do. And so I think the nature of the country, I mean, this is a little rambling and not totally, I think totally, fully getting at what you're saying, but I do think, some of this idea of multi-generational, family, multi-generational elites has been like, there. And, I don't know that like Jews and Catholics have done all that great at it either, to be quite honest. They struggle, with the same things. And, to the point that like, one of the concerns in the Jewish community for a long time has been that, basically gradual disappearance of Judaism among many people through intermarriage and other things that sort of dilutes identity. So one of the things about it is I think we have to a little bit start with the nature of the United States as a country. And it's like my friend in Germany said, he said, "Aaron, what you have to understand is we're the children of the people who stayed." I mean, the defining feature of America was folks who did not stay in their historic village, in their historic community, in that multi-generational place, and they went to America, and they built something new. And we've always been a dynamic protean nation. I did a lot of work in Spain, in my consulting career, and like in a place like Spain, what happens is basically you either live where you grew up or you move to the capital. Or maybe, you don't just move all over the place within Spain. And it's sort of like that, here you might grow up here, you might live where you grew up, and most Americans live relatively close to where they grew up. But it's like I might move to California, I might move to New York. We move all over.
Mm.
The paradigm of America was the frontier. Go west, young man.
Yes.
We're always leaving, always starting over. And I think this idea, like most Americans really aren't sitting on a family legacy that goes back much earlier than around 1990.
Right.
I mean, most of us don't have any family land.
Yeah.
I think about like, my grandparents, okay? So like my grandparents had a house in New Albany, Indiana. They sold it, moved into an apartment. Now they're dead. So like my mom built the house I basically grew up in the 70s. It's there. Are we going to keep it after she dies? Probably not, just be honest.
Mm.
It would be I think it would be nice to keep it, but like how am I going to take care of it? And so I feel like it's nice to think we think about inheriting all these heirlooms, but then it's like, wow, what am I gonna do with this punch bowl? Kind of thing. So I do think I think we're enamored of the idea of a multi-generational family,
Yeah.
myself included. And I think one reason we're here, as I said earlier, is we wanted to be close to our family. So it's like, okay, great. We're gonna like choose against being far away. We're gonna come home. Or I had this ideas. I mean, I had some big ideas that not all of them panned out. But like, I do think we have to like America is just not in our DNA a little bit at
Yeah.
some level.
Yeah.
We don't have family-owned businesses that go back 1,000 years like they do in Japan.
Right. Absolutely. Most Christian parents feel like their homes are stuck in survival mode, rushing, reading, drifting apart. The issue isn't effort, it's the blueprint. Culture says build your family around individuals. Scripture says build a team. That's why we wrote a free course called 5 Days to Transform Your Family into a Team. Each day gives you one short teaching and one simple step around mission, rhythm, and unity. It's free and takes just a few minutes a day. Start today at familyteams.com/transform. I would say in my life, kind of similarly, my parents grew up in Michigan. They left their family to go to Seattle. I grew up in Seattle. I feel like I'm a product of just keep going west, keep going in more an individual. We got to a certain point where I was like, I don't even know if I want to be a dad. Like I don't like what is the purpose of family? And I was very entrenched in evangelicalism. I really could articulate and was completely bought into the idea of being on mission for the kingdom of God, but I couldn't figure out exactly how that somehow came together with family. You know, I definitely had a dispensational eschatology like you were describing, which just compounds the confusion. And then I ended up in the Middle East met my wife in Jerusalem, and I just saw a completely different kind of father, essentially. Like these, like this, like a thick, both within the Arab and Jewish community, there was such an awareness of where they came from and a desire to see that continue into the future. And they seem to root that in theology, particularly in the Jewish Orthodox Jewish community and in the story of Abraham. I was kind of blown away by that. I spent some time studying that, and I was like, I'd never even heard this idea that what Abraham was doing and trying to build a multi-generational family is something that could be normative in the 21st century. But there I was surrounded by men who thought this way, but they were all exclusively Jews. And anyway, that really messed up my mind in the best way, I think. And I went from not really desiring to be a dad to now we, have 5 kids, and now we live, in a 4-generation house. So this is I think for me, one of the things that I sense is that Christian and evangelicalism doesn't have a really strong rooted understanding of a theology of family that is any deeper than sort of the cultural understanding. And so all the major waves that have hit the family, the Industrial Revolution, all the kind of the hyper individualism, we seem completely incapable of staying rooted in our own tradition when it comes to an understanding of how God designed family, whether or not He designed it to be multi-generational, or is it just about, raise your kids, launch them out, start over, get to that empty nest season. What's the goal? Like, what's the point of this? And this is where I was deeply confused.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you look at it again, I think this goes back to this lack of a idea of creation.
Yeah.
And like if you just Google the phrase "the idolatry of the family," you will get hundreds of thousands of hits back on Google. I mean, we're almost explicitly taught not to put too high value on a family,
Right.
and that it shouldn't matter if you don't have kids or not. It might even be better if you never get married. And, oh, by the way, your church, the spiritual family, the church family is a substitute
Right.
for the natural family, which is not. So there's like a lot of things there that I think come in with this sort of, you know, i- disembodied kind of thinking, about the world.
Yeah.
It's a little strange. Now, and the other thing is, I don't know what you're about your religious journey, but unlike say Judaism, uh, most evangelicals don't have what I would call a strong inherited faith. I mean, evangelicalism itself is not very old. So, I would say the average evangelical church is younger than me, hasn't been around that long. I mean, if you take some of the most iconic, um, evangelical churches, they were all founded within my lifetime. Willow Creek Church, Saddleback Church, Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York, founded in 1989.
Right.
So they haven't been around that long, and most people, uh, in these groups are people who sort of converted from something else.
Yeah.
They're not going to the church they grew up in. They've gone. Now, I'm sure there's lots of people who sort of grew up in a mega church environment still go to a mega church environment. But, I certainly don't do that. And I think about like this one thing I think about, my mother, who's from a Sicilian slash Germanic background, but we actually still have family in Sicily over there, so I could go visit them if I wanted. And, her family had been Catholic for over 1,000 years. Think about that. You've inherited a religion from your family for 1,000 years, and you just walk away from that. And I'm not saying it's, like, wrong of her to do it because, like, we all do I do the same thing. But, like, as Americans, we don't think about, like, this idea that, like,
Yeah.
I inherited my faith from my parents,
Right.
right? We don't even think about it that way. And so, and so it is a sort of a it is sort of a sense. And the other thing is because we don't have anything that's inherited, we're all a little bit LARPing in what we're doing in a sense. And like we're trying to create traditions where we don't have any. I mean, that's why I say everybody's trying to create like traditions that we feel keenly the loss. We're trying to create, we're trying to become Abraham
Right.
by creating the multi-generational family where we didn't really have this concept before. And so I don't think it's wrong at all to do that because I think that's where we are. We're kind of floating around in the ether
Right.
and we're kind of looking for some solid ground to stand on. And I think,
Yeah.
well, it's like we're going to have to try to create some solid ground.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
challenge is like, how do we get our children and then our grandchildren to buy into that?
Yes.
I can have all I can have all the great vision of the world that my son will live in this house,
Right.
but the odds of that are actually pretty low, kind of thing.
Yeah. That.
And so I think it is we're realizing how much is missing out of our lives,
Yeah.
and we're trying to recreate it, but it's because we didn't have it. And so that's the
That's
thing.
right.
It's like it's uh which I think is something that's I do think at least I think for even for some Catholics, it's like, okay, our families have been Catholics since they were in Europe. It's like we come from this Catholic ethnic family stock, and this is like part of our identity, which, by the way, is why the actual contents of the theology of the Catholic Church may not be as important to them as being part of the church, kind of like an identity of that. So
Yes.
there's like ups and downs that come from that. That's one reason they don't believe in what the church teaches, but they do have a strong sense of tie to it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, this is the absolute like core, I would say, of my interest is are there tools that exist that create durable multi-generational families? I would say
Mm.
if you want to put your like pin and what I'm trying to understand, that's it. And I would say that there are tools that I have been surprised. And it's important to almost catalog those tools and say, hey guys, we can look across the generations. When you come into a Western country like America, your family is going to get hit with a double dose of hyper individualism. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult to keep that family together generationally. They're going to be constantly hearing the message to, pursue your dreams, figure this out, develop an individual identity. And so what is it that actually causes families to stay together? So cataloging those tools, I would say like
Yep.
number one tool for me is the weekly multi-generational meal, 3 generations, one table every week. That is an incredibly powerful tradition. My family participated in that tradition, 80 years ago, and kind of abandoned it. And is there was not a championing of what that meant. And so in our family, we do a 4 generation meal every week. We tell family stories. It's a very rich, like I wanted to craft the kind of meal that my kids couldn't imagine not bringing my grandchildren to. And they grew up in that kind of a culture. This was all something that we, like you said, LARPing, like we just invented this because we saw it in these durable multi-generational family cultures. Family land, family businesses. Each of these things, each of these elements we started because of this attempt to understand what are the things that tends to draw the family closer together, like actually having a sense of place, understanding where we're from, caring a lot about the hyper local area, thinking about what that means, having children early and often, early marriage. I mean, all of these things. There are elements of that. Being prepared as a multi generational family to help your children, get their first house, live in proximity to the family. So we've done all these things and we've seen lots of other families do these things. But the thing that I'm trying to understand is like, again, like to your point about Googling idolatry of the family, it is fighting a lot of headwinds, not just from the culture, but from evangelicalism itself. And that's the part of it to me that bothers me the most. I'm like, what we tell families is, well, our diagnosis for what goes wrong with the family is just focus on the family. Do your duty, dad. And I'm like, that is not good enough. When I was in the Middle East, you didn't have to tell these dads to do their duty. They had a sense of incredibly profound sense of where they came from and what they were building. And the men were more likely to be committed to the family line than the women were. And of course, you see the inverse of that in our culture because of individualism. It's very confusing for men to understand, why would I sacrifice for this thing, right? For this thing called the family. And so you have to awaken inside of a man an Abrahamic sort of vision for the multi-generational family, I think, for them to really have the kind of passion that you see in these other cultures. And I think we're kind of like at the tail end of this with the fertility crisis. I'm not sure that any culture is going to be able to durably sustain any kind of fertility rate that's not deeply Abrahamic. But
Yeah.
we're the least Abrahamic of the Abrahamic religions. We're not getting our understanding or feeling for what we're building from Abraham, but it's right there in our Bible. I studied Abraham, a lot in seminary with John Sailhammer, who's one of the greatest evangelical scholars for the Torah and Abraham. We never talked about Abraham as a father. That was not a part of the conversation. There's something just missing, in this
Mm.
in this area that I did not receive as somebody who was deeply entrenched within evangelicalism, definitely second generation evangelical, and saw the breakdown. And I am profoundly um, like revolting against what I saw as extremely short-sighted building of the kinds of cultures that are durable, and why we're getting 80% of evangelical children are leaving the faith, and it's in
Yeah.
some extreme examples.
Well, I mean, you look at it and, you talk about multi-generational, like, we aren't even, like, getting the generational,
Right.
right, where we have a rising post-familial society
Yes.
with, significant, number of people delaying, not getting married. Probably quarter to a third of millennials are never gonna marry, it seems to be the estimate. Sociologist Brad Wilcox just posted this stat, somebody claimed it to him, and he's like, "That can't be true," so he went and calculated the data, and it is true that if a woman does not have a child by the age of 30, she only has about a 50% chance of ever having children.
Yeah.
So, like, half of all the women who are childless at age 30 are gonna end up childless permanently.
Yeah.
And so, we're seeing all these trends happen, and we're far from that, and of course, the church, you gotta say, like, in America, it's a religious marketplace, and so these churches need to attract people, and therefore, they have to, uh they basically can't make people feel too bad about themselves, and so
That's
when
right.
you have more and more singles sitting there,
Yes.
nobody wants to, make them feel too bad, and
Yeah.
so,
I've been
uh
explicitly told by evangelical pastors, we don't want to talk about family. It makes the families feel like judged. It makes the singles feel less included.
yeah, 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 so it's like, well, we can't talk about that because then somebody's gonna feel hurt, and so and of course, your average pastor got married very young to often the first or second woman he ever dated, has numerous children, and these people aren't trading their own family for all the gold in Fort Knox, right?
Yeah.
And then but they're not really repping, what they did. I mean, a
That's right.
lot of these guys will not say, "Well, here, look, let me tell you what I did." And, so I think there's, there's something to that is and so I think that the marketplace pressures make it difficult to really do it. And the other thing is what I call this, that what I call it's like the term du jour is biblicist, which is basically the idea, and I think this is very clearly how evangelicalism kind of operates is basically the answers to everything are in the Bible. And if it's not in the Bible, we can't really we have to proof text everything in the
Right.
Bible. So if we're talking about men and women, we're sort of limited to quoting whatever scriptures seem to talk about the nature of men and women.
Mm.
And so the idea that marriage with children is sort of normative
Right.
for humanity is not something people are going to say because they can't point to a proof text
Right.
verse in the Bible that
Mm.
says that's what it's supposed to be. Now, I think the Bible clearly shows that that is the case,
Right.
but they don't like to make statements that could be unpopular
Right.
that can't be directly tied back to a very explicit no wiggle room verse,
Right.
particularly when it's a countercultural pronouncement.
That's a good
You
point.
know, if we're talking about something that's more culturally aligned, we could kind of be a little more expansive. If it's not too controversial, we could be more expansive. But if we're going to say something controversial, and so that's like the gender wars, right? About whether women can be pastors or not, for example. You know, discussion over men's and women's roles in the family and society have basically been reduced to essentially two questions: like, can women be pastors, and are men the head of the home? Even the most conservative people basically don't make any arguments at all about men and women being different, except on those 2 points, which they can anchor to very specific scriptures. And so we have a very what I call a weak anthropology of gender, uh, too, and the idea that, like, men and women have many substantive differences on a whole range, of traits,
Mm,
that, and that's actually what, one of the reasons for the rise of Jordan Peterson,
yeah.
was his willingness to talk about those things. And, one of the things that made him that made him famous, there's a couple of things that made him famous. One of them was this interview he did on Channel 4 in England, and you can Google it, where this very hostile female interviewer gives him a hard time, and he just stands there and holds his ground and says things like, "Well, when it comes to the personality trait of agreeableness," which is one of the big 5 personality traits, "women are more agreeable on average than men." He goes through it, explains it, and this has certain implications. And we never talk about that stuff. And so I think ultimately this affects the idea of family too, because we can't really talk, well, is there a verse that says you have to get married?
Right.
It actually says over here it could be better to be single. So maybe we'll talk about that one. And so I feel like we've essentially sold out a lot of people's futures,
Yeah.
to be quite honest, by being less than candid with them about the implications of what it means to never get married and have kids,
Right. Yeah. Well.
which is
Yeah.
not a good life outcome in most places. I can tell you that.
Well, it's interesting to me, and I'm curious how you would think about within the gender debate. I kept hearing a battle go on between like sort of two frameworks. One is that gender is essentially a social construct, and so we can endlessly play with it, or it's a biological concept rooted in our DNA, and therefore all those differences. And you had biologists and others, like even Richard Dawkins, coming out and talking about the binary difference. And I think one of the things I always saw, just going back to your original point about a creation rooted faith, is in Genesis 1, it always seemed to me that gender was rooted in the family itself. That the reason why God created male and female was to give rise to the first family, and therefore is understanding masculinity, really trying to understand what God was trying to create when He wanted to create a father. Even you're looking at a 3-year-old or 5-year-old or 8-year-old boy, what you're essentially trying to do, and trying to like identify what it means for him to be a man or to develop in masculinity, is you're asking, what does it mean to be a good father? Like, these are the things. And then similarly with a woman, And so I've never heard whether or not, so theologically for me, how always has felt like gender is a family construct. But obviously it's rooted for me in an interpretation of Genesis. Like, this seems to me to be where these gender originally came from. Male and female, he created them and then gave them the command to be fruitful, multiply, fill, subdue, and rule. And so it was to give rise to a certain kind of family that we have the development of gender. I'm just curious, yeah, how does that strike you? This is not something I've had a chance to really talk to too many people about, but it's not something I've heard others really try to refer to either.
Well, I'm not a theologian, but this will be my amateur
Yeah,
thing about that. I mean, I think there is, it says it's not good for man to be alone,
yeah,
right? And so obviously you can't fill the earth without men and women in the family. So there's certainly something to that, that is, integral to carrying out the creation mandate to fill the earth. But
yes,
I don't think masculinity can be reduced to sort of family roles.
yeah,
Um, Prior to the creation of Eve, the actual only work that we ever see done in the garden prior to the fall is Adam's naming of the animals. So what we see with Adam naming the animals is a structuring and ordering activity in which, God created the world with its initial structure, the day and the night, the greater light and the lesser light, right? The stars, the land, sea, air, all the different orders, plants and animals, etc. But now Adam is extending that. Naming is a classic structuring and ordering activity. So there is a creative structuring and ordering call that is to that he is doing successfully prior to the creation of Eve, even. So I don't think that we can reduce masculinity completely to, in essence, how you relate to your wife and kids. And I think that is what the evangelical church has tended to do is, if you read the sort of conservative, um, gender, theology book, if you wanna call it that, from the complementarian group,
Yeah, yeah.
is called Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and, John Piper and Wayne Grudem did it, and he defines biblical masculinity in there. And basically, he defines biblical masculinity exclusively in terms of how men relate to women.
Mm,
And I don't think that that's the definition of masculinity.
mm,
And so I think that it includes that, but is not exclusive to it.
okay.
And so, I think there are many domains. I think the family is sort of normative. It's not. I mean, again, as the Bible make clear, it's not for everyone, but it's the norm. And I think we have a lot of trouble. I think we all want like a black or white answer.
Right.
It's always this or it's always that. It's like we just want hard and fast rules when in reality, and even much of the Bible makes clear, much of it is a matter of wisdom. We have to be wise, which
Right.
basically being wise is knowing what to do in the moment and how to handle all of these things. And it's like, yeah, if you have if God created you a certain way that you could be like Paul, not married, devote yourself in totality to ministry, that's great. Maybe you should think about that.
Yeah.
That's not how I was created. You know what I mean? And being able to understand which of these categories you fall into, and knowing that you won't always get it right. So I think there is like we have a low tolerance for ambiguity.
Right.
We want to say, men are like this, women are like that.
Mm,
Well, in reality, it may be true that men are taller than women on average, but there are women who are taller than men.
right.
And so it's like we have to be able to deal with things like overlapping distributions, the fact that like people are different, and so I think it's the same thing with kind of the evangelical. I critique the ideology of the family, but I do think evangelicalism overly emphasizes the role of women as wives and mothers, and sort of doesn't really offer like a whole lot beyond that. And I feel like we haven't articulated like how can women develop and deploy their talents in the world in a kind of way that's like affirmed and seen as positive and things of that nature. And so I think there's just like a lot of these things. It's complex, and again, it's not like there's like here's the formula.
Right.
It's there's no E equal MC2 formula. Force equal mass times. It's just here's the simple little thing. It's a little more gray because there's a lot of wisdom involved in it, and we have to think about that.
Yeah, I think this gets to the nub of like one of the first principle elements of is the individual the most basic like unit of society? Is it the family? Like, is it some kind of combination? Is there overlapping? Like that, there was a conversation between Sam Harris and Doug Wilson where this was what Doug Wilson really brought up. He's like, we see the basic unit being the family. You have there that tension between how to think about Naval Ravikant. He's one of his most famous tweets is life is a single player game. You're going to live alone. You're going to die alone. And I was just like, I don't experience life that. I mean, I get what he's saying, from the perspective of individual consciousness. But I was born into a family, and unless something goes terribly wrong, I'll be hopefully die surrounded by family. Like, are we in a multiplayer game? I do think that like that question to me is so fundamental, and so difficult for us to grapple with culturally because I think we've already seeded that it's an individual single player game, and we're playing that out in this sort of Western expanse. All the things you're describing, like we don't know how to pull back from like moving that direction into more and more quote unquote freedom, more and more hyper individualism. And if family, I don't see how that doesn't eventually deconstruct the family. Like as soon as that value gets so paramount and that becomes such a paradigm through which you see all of reality, as soon as your family interferes with your individual self-actualization, development, whatever, you're going to where does sacrifice for the family? Where does adopting, a family identity like father or mother, how does it how does it work when it collides with your individual passions, individual
Right.
development?
Well, again, I would say that there's a lot there, and again, not being a theological argument, I would say, but just sort of pointing out the implications. The overwhelming majority of evangelicals are Baptistic. They're Baptists, and Baptistic theology is an individualist theology
Right.
because there's no concept of family covenant. It's, regenerate church membership only, which basically means individual adult professions of faith. There's no concept of, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord kind of thing. Again, I'm not making a theology of baptism here, but it is an implicitly individualistic conception
Yes.
of Christianity and the church. That's just how evangelicals are wired,
Yes.
right? It's definitely how it's wired.
Yeah, and that's what I would say. If I, drilling into kind of first principles theologically, in terms of philosophy, that's the conversation I want to have. Is like what is at that base root? Did we the fact that there are more household salvations in Acts than individual salvations, the fact that you do see in these other cultures an appreciation. We are studying the New Testament where it is a single generation book. There's not a single child listed in the New Testament that is a child of a Christian family. We don't know the names of any child. There's what we have in the New Testament, such a one generation book, assuming that as Gentiles were coming to the faith, they were being discipled through the Torah and through the Hebrew scriptures. And I think that there's been just a lot of confusion I see just theologically between the way that we have interpreted, like in the Old Testament. Abraham to me is that quintessential example. Avram, his original name, exalted father. Like it sounds and connotates something symbolically, something very different to the Hebrew mind than it does to the English mind. We don't really gain a understanding of family deeply from watching how Abraham lives. We see that as a primitive element of his culture. And that's sort of our bias, I think, theologically. And so that's part of where, yeah, I've been really trying to understand that. So Aaron, this has been really good. I love getting to have these first principles. I just want to say thank you again for all the sort of the deep work you're doing and trying to understand where this movement, like how to situate it. It's been incredibly helpful. How can people find out more about you? Any projects you're working on that we could call out? What we're going
Subscribe
today?
to my newsletter, aaronrenn.com, aaronrenn.com. Sign up.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate what you're doing there on the newsletter, Substack. It's super helpful. And thank you so much for jumping on here today with me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.